Chapter 1: The First Collision. The golden chandelier above cast an eerie glow over the ballroom, its dangling crystals catching the light like shards of a shattered dream. Scarlet Hayes stood near the edge of the grand room, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass as she scanned the sea of silk gowns and tailored suits. This world wasn't hers. Not really. The only reason she was here, surrounded by billionaires, heirs, and socialites, was because of a professor who thought networking with the city's elite would open doors for a journalism major like her. Scarlet had never believed in relying on powerful men to get ahead. She'd fight for her future the hard way, on her own. Then why, she wondered, did she feel the weight of someone's gaze on her? A slow prickling sensation crawled up her spine. She turned, her heart giving an unexpected stutter. Lucian Blackwood. Even she, who had little interest in corporate scandals, knew his name. A self-made billionaire. A man with no patience for weakness. The kind of man who owned people with nothing more than a well-placed glance. And right now, he was looking at her. Scarlet willed herself to hold his gaze, refusing to be another woman who melted beneath the intensity of those cold, predatory eyes. His lips curled. Not quite a smile, more a dark amusement at her defiance. She turned away first. And that's when she heard the slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. Scarlet exhaled slowly, forcing herself to focus on her drink. She wasn't here to make an impression. She wasn't here for him. But that didn't stop Lucian from closing the distance between them. Miss Hayes. His voice was low, rich, a sound made to command. Scarlet turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze without giving him the satisfaction of her full attention. Mr. Blackwood. Amusement flickered in his midnight eyes. You know my name. It would be impossible not to. She sipped her champagne, feigning indifference. Your face is practically a city landmark at this point. A dark chuckle. Flattery? A fact. Lucian stepped closer, invading the space that had kept her comfortable. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His presence alone wrapped around her like a noose, tightening with each passing second. You don't belong here, he murmured, his tone unreadable. Scarlet's fingers clenched around her glass. Excuse me? This world, he said, gesturing vaguely to the opulent ballroom. It's not for people like you. Her breath caught. The audacity. The arrogance. Scarlet turned fully to face him, her chin lifting. And yet, here I am. Lucian's smirk deepened, but something in his expression sharpened. Yes, he murmured. Here you are. Scarlet refused to let the moment stretch between them. She wasn't going to entertain whatever game he was playing. Well, it's been lovely, Mr. Blackwood, she said, turning to walk away. A mistake, because Lucian moved. Not with force, not with aggression. Just a subtle, calculated step that cut her off. Scarlet stopped short, pulse hammering. You misunderstand me, Lucian said, his voice like silk-wrapped steel. I didn't mean you shouldn't be here. I meant you stand out. Scarlet swallowed. I don't see how that's any of your concern. His gaze flickered down her body, not in the crude way most men would, but like he was assessing her, seeing too much. You intrigue me. Scarlet almost laughed. I'm sure that's new for you. It is, he said, and something in the way he admitted it made her breath hitch. There was no arrogance in his tone, no empty flattery. Just fact, dangerous fact. Scarlet should have walked away. She should have excused herself, found an exit, and never looked back. Instead, she held his gaze and said, Well, that sounds like your problem, not mine. Lucian stilled, just for a second, and then he smiled, a slow, dark thing that sent a shiver through her spine. Run. The thought whispered through her mind like a warning, and yet she didn't move. The challenge. Scarlet managed to escape their conversation that night, but she knew it wasn't over. And she was right. The next morning, she received an email from her university, an offer for an exclusive internship at Blackwood Enterprises, a company she had never applied to. Her heart pounded as she read the details. Paid tuition, generous stipend, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Scarlet's stomach twisted. This wasn't an internship. This was him. Lucian Blackwood was making his first move, and Scarlet had no idea if she could stop him. Scarlet stared at the email on her screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The words blurred together, but the weight of their meaning was crystal clear. An internship. At Blackwood Enterprises. She hadn't applied. She hadn't even considered applying. Yet somehow there it was, a personalized offer dangling in front of her like a poisoned apple. Scarlett's pulse thundered in her ears. This wasn't a coincidence. This was him, Lucian Blackwood. She could still hear his voice from last night, smooth and inescapable, wrapping around her like silk and steel. You intrigue me. A chill traced down her spine. Was this what he did? Set his sights on someone and then pull the strings until they had no choice but to fall in line? Scarlett exhaled sharply, clicking out of the email. She wouldn't play his game. She wouldn't even dignify it with a response. Instead, she grabbed her bag and headed to class, forcing herself to push the thought of him, of his gaze, his words, out of her mind. But the day wouldn't let her forget. Her professor called her in after the lecture, congratulating her on landing such a prestigious internship. Classmates she barely spoke to whispered as she walked by, a mixture of curiosity and envy in their eyes. By the time she made it to the library, her inbox had flooded with messages, people assuming she had some inside connection to Blackwood Enterprises, asking how she'd gotten the opportunity. Scarlett gritted her teeth. She hadn't gotten anything. Lucian had placed it in front of her, expecting her to take the bait. She wouldn't. That night, she sat in her tiny apartment, staring at her laptop screen, her cursor blinking over a decline email she had typed but hesitated to send. Because the truth was, an opportunity like this was rare. Even without Lucian's interference, people fought for positions at Blackwood Enterprises. Her professor had already assumed she'd take it. Her tuition, her expenses, everything could be covered in an instant. And yet, accepting would mean playing into his hands. Scarlett shut the laptop with a frustrated sigh, shoving it away. She wouldn't let Lucian Blackwood control her. She wouldn't. A knock at her door sent her heart slamming against her ribs. Scarlett froze. It was late. No one ever came by unannounced. Slowly she stood, inching toward the door. Who is it? Silence. Her pulse pounded. Then, a voice, low, commanding. Open the door, Scarlett. A shiver shot through her limbs. She knew that voice, Lucian. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had spent the entire day trying to ignore him, trying to pretend he wasn't closing in on her, and now he was here, outside her door, her fingers curled into fists. I don't recall inviting you, Rut, she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. You didn't. A pause. Open the door. Scarlett clenched her jaw. She should ignore him, should tell him to leave. But something in his tone, dark, assured, as if he knew she'd comply, made her blood boil. With a slow breath, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. Lucian stood in the dim hallway, his presence overwhelming even in the small space. He was still in a suit, the black fabric hugging his broad frame, but his tie was loosened, at his shirt collar slightly undone, as if he'd had more important things to do than keep up appearances, like hunting her down. Scarlett crossed her arms, blocking the doorway. What do you want? Lucian tilted his head slightly, eyes sweeping over her. You haven't responded to my offer. She exhaled a sharp laugh. That's because I'm not taking it. He studied her for a long moment. Then slowly he reached out. Scarlett didn't move as his fingers brushed the frame of the door just inches from where she stood. Not touching her, but close. Why not? He asked, his voice quiet. Her pulse raced. Because I don't trust you, she said honestly. Lucian's lips curled into something between amusement and challenge. And yet, he murmured, you still opened the door for me. Scarlett's breath hitched. Damn him. The way he spoke, the way he looked at her. It was like he was peeling back her defenses layer by layer, unraveling her without even touching her. I won't be owned, Lucian, she said, her voice hard. And that's what this is, isn't it? A way to control me? His gaze darkened, and for the first time there was no amusement. If I wanted to own you, he said, voice rough, you'd already be mine. The words sent a shock through her chest. Scarlett swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold his gaze. She should slam the door in his face. She should end this here, but she didn't, and Lucian knew it. A slow, knowing smirk touched his lips as he stepped back. I'll see you at the office, he said, turning away. Scarlett's stomach dropped. I didn't accept, you will. And with that, he disappeared down the hall, leaving her breathless, furious, and more tangled in his web than ever before. Chapter 3. Scarlett barely slept that night. Lucian Blackwood's words echoed in her mind, twisting into her dreams, leaving her restless and burning with frustration. If I wanted to own you, you'd already be mine. She hated him. Hated the way he spoke with such certainty, as if her choices were already made, as if he had already decided the outcome. And yet, When the sun rose and her alarm blared, the first thing she saw was the unopened email on her laptop screen. The internship. A decision waiting to be made. Scarlett exhaled sharply and pushed out of bed, ignoring the weight in her chest. She had class, and she refused to let Lucian Blackwood dictate her thoughts, no matter how much his presence lingered beneath her skin. But the day did little to distract her. Her professor brought up the internship again, going on about how this was a rare chance that could change her future. Her classmates whispered behind her back, curiosity in their eyes. By the time she made it to the library, she was tired of the attention, tired of the way Lucian's influence had already begun to affect her life. She opened her laptop, hovered over the email. Then, before she could think twice, she hit accept. It wasn't about him. It was about her future, her career. She wouldn't let him scare her out of taking something she deserved. Scarlett shut her laptop, squared her shoulders, and refused to let herself feel regret. But regret came the moment she walked into Blackwood Enterprises the next morning. The towering skyscraper loomed over her, sleek and modern, its glass windows reflecting the world back at her like a warning. She stepped through the revolving doors, heart hammering in her chest, her heels clicking against the marble floors as she approached the reception desk. The woman behind the desk barely looked up. Name? Scarlett Hayes. The receptionist's fingers moved across the keyboard. Then, after a beat, she gave a tight nod. Mr. Blackwood is expecting you. Scarlett's stomach twisted. Of course he was. She was led through sleek hallways, past floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The office was a kingdom, and Lucian Blackwood was the untouchable ruler. But she wasn't here to kneel. The elevator ride was silent, the tension thick as the doors finally slid open to reveal the top floor. His domain. Scarlett stepped out cautiously, her heart pounding as the receptionist gestured toward the large black doors at the end of the hall. You can go in. Scarlett swallowed hard and nodded. Then, forcing herself to appear calm, in control, she stepped forward and pushed the doors open. Lucian was waiting for her. He stood behind a massive black desk, dressed in another impossibly expensive suit, his tie undone as if he had barely tolerated wearing it. His dark eyes flickered up the moment she entered, and for a second the air in the room shifted, like he had been waiting for this moment. Scarlett forced herself to close the door behind her, lifting her chin. I accepted the internship, she said flatly. Lucian's lips curled slightly. I noticed. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver through her spine. I didn't take it for you, she continued. I took it because it's a good opportunity, because it benefits me. Lucian leaned back against his desk, watching her with that same unreadable intensity. Of course. Scarlett narrowed her eyes. You don't believe me. He let the silence stretch between them before finally speaking. I believe you're telling yourself whatever you need to, he murmured, to justify stepping into my world. Scarlett's breath caught. She hated how easily he saw through her, how he stripped her defenses down with nothing more than a few well-placed words. She straightened her spine. If this is your way of trying to intimidate me, it's not working. Lucian tilted his head slightly, considering her. Then, slowly, he pushed off the desk and stepped toward her. Scarlett held her ground as he closed the space between them, stopping just inches away, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, smell the faint trace of expensive cologne. I don't need to intimidate you, Scarlett, he murmured. I already own the world you've just stepped into. Her heart pounded. I don't care, she whispered. Lucian's lips barely twitched. Liar. Scarlett clenched her fists at her sides. I won't be your game, that, she said. Lucian studied her, then reached up so slowly and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The touch barely existed, yet it left a trail of fire across her skin. Then stop playing, he murmured. Scarlett exhaled sharply, stepping back. She needed to get out of here, needed distance before she did something reckless, something stupid. It'll be ready for my first assignment, she said tightly, turning toward the door. Lucian didn't stop her. But as she reached for the handle, his voice drifted toward her, soft and dangerous. I'll enjoy watching you try to resist me, Scarlett. She didn't turn back, because deep down she feared he was right. Chapter 4. Scarlett spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the weight of Lucian's words. But they stayed, like an invisible thread wrapped around her, tightening with every step she took in his domain. She tried to focus on the orientation process, meeting the other interns, listening to the department heads as they outlined expectations. She kept her posture straight, her expression neutral, and acted as though she wasn't hyper-aware of the fact that he was somewhere in this building, watching, waiting. Scarlett hated it, hated that she felt him even when he wasn't in the room. By lunchtime, she was desperate for air. She slipped away from the executive floor, stepping into the quieter halls where the employees weren't looking at her with the same curiosity they had earlier. She found a small break room, empty except for the hum of the coffee machine. Scarlett exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the counter. She needed to get a grip. This was just a job, but no amount of rationalizing could erase the way Lucian had looked at her, the way he had spoken to her, like she was something he had already claimed. A door creaked open behind her. Scarlett tensed, her pulse kicking up before she even turned. Lucian, of course. He leaned against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, watching her with the same unreadable intensity that had been haunting her all day. "Are you hiding from me, Scarlett?" Scarlett rolled her eyes, turning back to the coffee machine. "The world doesn't revolve around you, Blackwood." A deep chuckle. Slow footsteps. The air shifted, the heat of him crawling against her skin as he stepped closer. "You've been avoiding me," he murmured. Scarlett grabbed a cup, willing her hands not to shake. "I've been working." Lucian's gaze burned into the side of her face. "Is that what you tell yourself?" Scarlett exhaled sharply, turning to face him. "Why are you here?" Lucian's smirk was slow, deliberate. "This is my building." She hated the way his presence filled every inch of the room, hated that even now, with nothing but a breath of space between them, she could feel the pull, dark, inescapable, inevitable. Scarlett crossed her arms, forcing herself to stay calm. "You can't intimidate me into quitting." Lucian stepped closer. "I don't want you to quit." Her throat tightened. Then why did it feel like she was teetering on the edge of something dangerous? Lucian reached past her, his hand brushing against her hip as he grabbed a cup from the counter. The touch was barely there, but it lingered, sending an unwelcome shiver up her spine. Scarlett inhaled sharply. "You really can't help yourself, can you?" Lucian filled his cup, not bothering to deny it. "No." Her stomach twisted. "That's not an answer." Lucian turned to face her fully, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "It's the only one you're going to get." Scarlett hated that she didn't look away. Hated that a part of her wanted to push, wanted to know exactly how far he was willing to go. Lucian tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You don't trust me." Scarlett let out a breathless laugh. "Obviously." Lucian set his cup down, stepping into her space, not touching her, but close enough that she felt the heat of him, the force of his presence pressing against her like a storm waiting to break. "You will." Scarlett's heart stopped. Lucian's voice was quiet, but there was no arrogance in it, just certainty, just absolute, unwavering belief. It should have terrified her. Instead, it sent fire racing through her veins. Scarlett clenched her jaw. "You think you own everything you touch." Lucian's lips curled. "No, just the things that belong to me." Her breath hitched. She needed to leave, needed to run before she did something reckless. Scarlett turned sharply, pushing past him and heading for the door. But just as she reached it, his voice stopped her in her tracks. "You'll come to me, Scarlett, sooner than you think." Scarlett didn't respond. She couldn't, because deep down, in the part of her she refused to acknowledge, she was afraid he was right. Chapter 5. Scarlett avoided Lucian for the next 2 days. Or, at least, she tried. It wasn't easy when his name was on every email, his presence lurking in every corridor, his influence woven into the very foundation of Blackwood Enterprises. Even when he wasn't there, he was everywhere. But she refused to give him the satisfaction of running. Instead, she focused on her work, on proving that she belonged here on her own terms. The other interns were eager to impress, some fawning over the opportunity, others sizing up the competition. Scarlett ignored all of it. She wouldn't let Lucian Blackwood get inside her head. She wouldn't. The elevator doors slid open, and there he was. Scarlett's pulse stuttered. Lucian stepped into the hallway, his gaze cutting straight to her, like he had known exactly where she would be. The air tightened. Scarlett forced herself to keep walking, ignoring the way her heart slammed against her ribs. She had spent the last 2 days avoiding him, but now, Lucian moved, a simple, effortless step into her path, blocking her escape. Scarlet exhaled sharply, stopping inches from him. She refused to step back, refused to give him that power. Lucian's dark eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You've been ignoring me." Scarlet lifted her chin. "I've been working." Lucian's lips curved slightly. "So you say." Her fingers curled into fists. "Do you need something, Mr. Blackwood?" Lucian tilted his head slightly, studying her. The elevator doors slid shut behind him, leaving them alone in the hallway. "You're struggling," he said smoothly. Scarlet's jaw clenched. "Excuse me?" Lucian's gaze flickered over her, slow and deliberate. Not in a way that felt crude, but like he was reading her, seeing something she hadn't meant to show. "You're used to fighting," he murmured. "You don't know how to handle this." Scarlet's stomach twisted. She hated that he saw her so clearly. Hated that he could read her, even when she fought to keep her walls up. She swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." Lucian stepped closer. Scarlet refused to move, even as his presence pressed against her, the scent of his cologne curling around her senses. "You keep telling yourself you have control," he murmured. "But you feel it, don't you?" Her breath caught. Lucian's gaze was dark, dangerous. "This pull," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The way you react when I'm near." Scarlet's pulse pounded. She hated him, hated the way his words wrapped around her like a noose, tightening with every syllable. "I don't." Lucian reached up, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The touch was feather-light, barely there, but it burned. Scarlet sucked in a sharp breath. Lucian's lips barely curled. "Lie to yourself all you want." Scarlet forced herself to move, stepped back. The moment broke. The air shifted. Lucian let her go, but the knowing in his eyes said it all. She had reacted, and he had noticed. Scarlet turned on her heel and walked away, heart pounding, but even as she left she could still feel him, watching, waiting, and for the first time she feared she was already too deep. Chapter 6. Scarlet told herself she was fine, that Lucian Blackwood was just a man, that his presence didn't unsettle her, that his voice didn't make her heart race, that the way he looked at her didn't unravel something dangerous inside her. She was lying. For the past week, she had done everything possible to avoid him. She arrived early, left late, took meetings that weren't necessary, kept her head down, focused on work. She told herself that if she ignored him long enough, this thing between them would disappear. It didn't, because Lucian wouldn't let it. She felt him in the room before she saw him. A meeting she wasn't expecting, a glance across the office, the briefest brush of his fingers as he handed her a file. He was everywhere, a presence that pressed into her, taking up too much space, too much power, and every time she thought she could breathe, he found a way to remind her. She wasn't running from him. She was running in circles, and he was just waiting for her to stop. The day started like any other. Scarlet buried herself in work, reviewing documents and trying to keep her mind from drifting toward him. But just as she thought she had settled into a rhythm, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Conference room. Now. Her stomach twisted. She didn't need to guess who it was. Scarlet considered ignoring it, pretending she hadn't seen it. But she knew better. Lucian Blackwood didn't send requests. He sent summons, and if she didn't comply, he would find another way to get what he wanted. She inhaled sharply and stood, smoothing her skirt before heading toward the conference room. The moment she stepped inside, she regretted it. Lucian stood by the windows, his hands in his pockets, his suit immaculate. Sunlight filtered through the glass, casting long shadows that stretched toward her. He didn't turn immediately, didn't acknowledge her presence, because he knew she was already watching him. Scarlet exhaled through her nose. "What do you want?" Lucian turned then, slow and deliberate, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Close the door." Scarlet's fingers curled around the doorknob. "I'd rather not." "I'd rather not." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. "Scarlet, it wasn't a request." Something inside her twisted, something that wanted to defy him just to see if he would break. But she knew better. She had learned that pushing Lucian Blackwood had consequences. Scarlet shut the door. Lucian studied her for a moment, then stepped closer, his movements controlled, predatory. "You've been avoiding me." Scarlet forced herself to meet his gaze. "I've been working," Lucian hummed as if considering her words. "And yet you seem to disappear the moment I enter a room." Scarlet lifted her chin. "You're imagining things." Lucian's lips curled slightly. "Am I?" The space between them vanished. Scarlett's breath caught as Lucien reached out, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was soft, too soft, given the tension crackling between them. She should have stepped back, should have slapped his hand away. Instead, she stood frozen, trapped between the instinct to fight and the unbearable heat of wanting. Lucien's gaze flickered over her, something dark and hungry gleaming in his eyes. "You're still lying to yourself." Scarlett swallowed hard. "About what?" Lucien's thumb traced along her jaw, slow and deliberate. "About how much you want this." Her pulse pounded. Scarlett's lips parted, a sharp retort on the tip of her tongue, but Lucien moved first, closing the distance completely, his body so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. "I see it," he murmured. "In the way you react, in the way you stay when you should have run." Scarlett's breath shuddered. "You think you know me?" Lucien smirked. "I know what I see." Scarlett's resolve fractured. Her body betrayed her, leaning into him just slightly. Just enough for Lucien's smirk to darken. His fingers skimmed lower, tracing the side of her neck, a touch so light it burned. "Say the word, Scarlett," he murmured. "Tell me to stop." Scarlett's heart slammed against her ribs. She knew he was giving her a choice, knew that if she told him to stop, he would, but the words wouldn't come. Lucien's lips hovered near her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Nothing?" Scarlett clenched her fists. "Say it. Tell him to stop." But she didn't, and Lucien knew it. A deep, satisfied sound rumbled from his chest. His hand slid lower, fingers skimming the bare skin just beneath the collar of her blouse. Scarlett inhaled sharply, her body igniting like fire meeting oxygen. Lucien's voice was low, intoxicating. "You can fight this all you want, Scarlett." Scarlett squeezed her eyes shut. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." Lucien's hand fell away. She gasped at the loss of contact, her eyes snapping open. Lucien watched her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned. "I told you," he murmured. "You'll come to me." Scarlett hated that he was right, and she hated herself more for wanting to let it happen. Chapter 7. Scarlett barely made it through the rest of the day. Her body was still humming from Lucien's touch, her mind tangled in the memory of his voice, his heat, his certainty. She hated him for it, hated the way he peeled her open without ever needing to raise his voice or force her hand. He didn't need to. Because he knew. He knew she felt it too. That night, Scarlett sat in her apartment, the city lights spilling through her window. She tried to focus on her work, to drown out the phantom of his touch, but no amount of distraction could erase the truth. Lucien Blackwood had gotten under her skin, and worse, she had let him. Her phone vibrated on the table. She ignored it at first, but when it buzzed again, she exhaled sharply and glanced at the screen. A message. "Come outside." Scarlett's breath caught. She stared at the words, her heart pounding. No name, no explanation, but she knew. Lucien. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the phone down. She should ignore him. She should pretend she never saw it. But before she could talk herself out of it, she was standing, grabbing her coat, and stepping into the cool night air. And there he was. Lucien leaned against his sleek black car, dressed in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, his sleeves rolled up as if he had abandoned his usual polished perfection for something more dangerous. More real. Scarlett crossed her arms. "Stalking me now?" Lucien's lips curved slightly. "I don't stalk. I simply get what I want." Scarlett exhaled through her nose. "And what exactly do you want?" Lucien pushed off the car, stepping toward her with slow, deliberate steps. "You." Her stomach twisted. She hated how effortlessly he said it, hated that he didn't even try to soften it. Scarlett lifted her chin. "I'm not something you can just take, Lucien." His smirk darkened. "Aren't you?" Scarlett's pulse spiked. Lucien reached out, tracing a single finger along her wrist. "You're still here, aren't you?" Scarlett ripped her arm away. "That doesn't mean anything." Lucien studied her, his gaze heavy, unreadable. Then he stepped even closer, close enough that their bodies nearly touched. "You keep saying no," he murmured, "but your body says otherwise." Scarlett's breath hitched. She wanted to slap him, wanted to walk away. But she didn't. Lucien tilted his head slightly, watching her with that same calm intensity that had always unraveled her. "You want me to prove it?" Scarlett swallowed hard. "Don't." Lucien's fingers brushed along her jaw, tilting her chin up. "Say the word, Scarlett." Scarlett's body betrayed her, leaning into him just slightly, just enough for Lucien's smirk to deepen. And then, as if sensing she was about to break, he pulled away. Scarlett inhaled sharply, her balance tilting. Lucian stepped back, adjusting his cuffs. "Not yet," he murmured, "but soon." Scarlett hated the way her skin still burned from his touch, hated the way her body had wanted more. She turned sharply and walked away, refusing to look back. But Lucian's words followed her. Not yet, but soon. And deep down, Scarlett feared he was right. Chapter 8. Scarlett had spent the last 2 days trying to forget the way Lucian looked at her, trying to erase the feeling of his touch, the way his voice wrapped around her like silk and steel, making her body betray her in ways she refused to acknowledge. She wasn't his. She refused to be. And yet, the moment she opened her apartment door that night and saw him standing there, tension coiled in every inch of his frame, she knew she had lost the battle before it even began. Lucian didn't ask to be let in, didn't wait for permission. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with slow, deliberate control. But his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, told a different story. Scarlett swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold her ground. "What are you doing here?" Lucian's gaze burned into hers. "I told myself I wouldn't come." Her heart pounded. His voice was lower than usual, rough, strained, like he was fighting something, like he had lost control the moment she had opened the door. Scarlett exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. "Then leave." Lucian didn't move, didn't blink. Then, in one fluid, predatory motion, he was on her. Scarlett gasped as her back hit the wall, his body pressing against hers, heat radiating off him in waves. His hands slammed onto the wall beside her head, caging her in, his breath brushing against her skin. He was holding himself back. Barely. "Tell me to go," he murmured, his voice dangerously low. Scarlett's pulse thundered. She opened her mouth, ready to tell him exactly that, ready to push him away, to prove that she was stronger than this, stronger than him. But no words came. Lucian's lips barely twitched, his eyes darkening. "That's what I thought." Then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was raw, consuming, filled with weeks of unspoken tension, of wanting, of fighting a battle they had both already lost. Scarlett should have resisted, should have pushed him away. Instead, she broke. She let herself fall. And Lucian, the man who had spent weeks unraveling her piece by piece, caught her. That night, he didn't hold back, and neither did she. The morning light streamed through the curtains, painting golden lines across Scarlett's skin. Lucian was still there. She had expected him to be gone, expected to wake up alone, but instead his arm was draped over her waist, his body warm against hers. Scarlett swallowed hard, staring at the ceiling. What had she done? She needed to think, needed to process what this meant, what he would make of it. Carefully, she started to move, trying to slip from beneath his hold without waking him. But the moment she shifted, his grip tightened. Scarlett froze. Lucian's lips brushed against her bare shoulder, his voice gravelly from sleep. "Going somewhere?" Scarlett closed her eyes, hating the way his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "I need to get ready for work." Lucian hummed, his fingers tracing lazy circles on her hip. "Call in sick." Scarlett's stomach flipped. "Lucian." His grip tightened slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to make her feel it. "Say it again." Scarlett's breath hitched. He was testing her. She exhaled sharply, pushing against his chest. "Let me up." Lucian didn't resist. Not completely. But as she moved to sit up, his hand caught her wrist, his grip firm. His eyes were still dark, still heavy with something unspoken. "I meant what I said," he murmured. Scarlett swallowed. "About what?" Lucian's gaze didn't waver. "You're mine now." Her pulse stuttered. He said it so simply, like it was fact, like the night before had sealed something unbreakable. Scarlett forced herself to breathe, to keep her voice steady. "I'm not something you can claim, Lucian." Lucian's lips barely twitched. "Well, see about that." And the terrifying part, a part of her already knew he was right. Chapter 9. Scarlett had spent the last few weeks pretending nothing had changed. Pretending Lucian's presence in her life wasn't suffocating, that his touch hadn't marked her in ways she couldn't erase. She told herself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness that meant nothing. But deep down, she knew the truth. And now, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at the pregnancy test in her shaking hands, that truth was inescapable. Pregnant. Scarlett's breath hitched, her vision blurring. This couldn't be happening. She couldn't be pregnant with Lucian Blackwood's child. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the sink, her stomach twisting violently. No, not just a child. 3. She had gone to the doctor that morning, desperate to confirm what she already feared. The moment the words left the doctor's mouth, triplets, the air had rushed out of her lungs. Scarlett had barely made it back home before the panic set in. She pressed a hand to her flat stomach, her pulse hammering. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready for him to know. Because she knew exactly what Lucien would do. He wouldn't let her go. He wouldn't let her leave. Scarlett's breath came faster, her chest tightening. She needed to think. She needed to run before it was too late. A knock at the door sent her heart slamming against her ribs. She froze. For a second, she told herself she was imagining it, that Lucien wasn't standing outside her apartment, that he hadn't come for her. But he had. Scarlett forced herself to move, wiping her hands on her jeans before hesitantly stepping toward the door. She knew she looked pale, shaken, but she didn't have time to fix it. Another knock, firmer this time. She took a deep breath and pulled the door open. Lucien stood there, dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, his impossibly dark, piercing eyes, they saw too much. Scarlett swallowed hard. "What are you doing here?" Lucien didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept over her, lingering on her face, her tense posture, the way she clutched the doorframe like she needed it to stay upright. His jaw tightened. "What's wrong?" Scarlett's stomach dropped. Damn him. Damn his ability to read her like an open book, to pick apart her defenses with nothing but a single glance. "Nothing," she lied, forcing her voice to stay steady. Lucien stepped closer, his presence wrapping around her like a shadow. "Don't lie to me." Scarlett's fingers dug into the doorframe. She had to get him out of here, had to keep this secret buried before he found out and took everything from her. "I'm fine," she said tightly. Lucien's gaze flickered past her, toward the dimly lit apartment. "You didn't come to work today." Scarlett's pulse stuttered. Of course he noticed. "I wasn't feeling well," she said quickly. Lucien didn't move, but his presence felt heavier, like a storm building right in front of her. Then, before she could react, he stepped inside, forcing her back into the apartment. Scarlett inhaled sharply. Lucien, his eyes locked onto hers, demanding something she wasn't ready to give. "Tell me the truth." Scarlett's throat tightened. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Because the second he knew, the second he found out what was growing inside her, she would never be free again. Lucien stepped closer, the air between them charged with something dark, something inevitable. Scarlett took a step back, her pulse hammering. "You can't just barge in here and..." His gaze flickered to the table, where the ultrasound image still lay, carelessly left out in her moment of panic. Scarlett's stomach dropped. Lucien stilled. The silence was thick, suffocating. Then, slowly, he reached for the image, picking it up with careful fingers, his gaze locked on the small, grainy outline of what was unmistakably his children. Scarlett's breath came in shallow bursts. Lucien didn't say anything at first, but when he looked up, something had shifted. Something dark. Something dangerous. His fingers curled around the image, his grip tight. "You were going to hide this from me." Scarlett forced herself to stand taller, to fight against the panic rising in her chest. "I was going to tell you." Lucien's voice was low, lethal. "No, you weren't." Scarlett's heart slammed against her ribs. Lucien took a slow, measured step toward her. "You were going to leave." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Because he was right. Lucien exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face before looking at her again, really looking at her. "How long have you known?" Scarlett clenched her jaw. "A few weeks." Lucien's grip on the ultrasound tightened. "And in those weeks, you planned to disappear, with my children." Scarlett swallowed hard. "They're not just yours." Lucien's jaw ticked. "Don't test me, Scarlett." Scarlett refused to back down, despite the fear clawing at her throat. "You're controlling. You manipulate everything in your world to fit your needs. I knew the second you found out you'd try to take them from me." Lucien's eyes darkened. "You think I would let you go?" Scarlett's breath caught. Lucien took another step closer, his presence overwhelming, his control hanging by a thread. "You carry my children. You belong to me." Scarlett's stomach twisted. "I'm not your property, Lucien." His gaze burned into hers. "No, you're something far more important." Scarlett's hands shook. She had known Lucien would react badly, had known he wouldn't simply let her walk away. But the raw, possessive fury in his expression, that was something she wasn't prepared for. Lucien exhaled slowly, his voice dropping into something dangerous. You won't run, Scarlet. Scarlet lifted her chin, trying to mask her fear. And how do you plan to stop me? Lucian's smirk was slow, dark. You'll see. Scarlet's blood ran cold, because in that moment she realized something chilling. Lucian Blackwood wasn't just going to fight for his children, he was going to make sure she never left his side again. Chapter 10. Scarlet barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, Lucian's words echoed in her mind. You won't run, Scarlet. You'll see. She had known Lucian was possessive. She had known he didn't let go of the things he considered his. But this was something else entirely. Scarlet lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. Triplets. She still hadn't fully wrapped her mind around the fact that she was carrying 3 lives inside her. Lucian wouldn't just fight for them. He would never let her leave. A lump formed in her throat. She had to go. Before it was too late. Scarlet turned onto her side, her mind racing. How? How could she disappear when Lucian controlled everything? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Her heart clenched. She already knew who it was. Slowly she reached for it, her fingers tightening around the cold metal as she glanced at the screen. Lucian, get some rest. You need it. Scarlet's pulse spiked. She hadn't told him she was awake. She hadn't texted him back. Her fingers curled around the phone. Was he watching her? A slow shiver ran down her spine. She needed to leave. Now. Scarlet sat up carefully, her heart pounding against her ribs. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, reaching for the bag she had packed earlier. She hadn't told anyone about her plans, hadn't even dared to call a friend for help. Lucian would find out, and she couldn't let that happen. Taking a slow, steadying breath, she tiptoed toward the front door, her bag slung over her shoulder. She had money, not much, but enough to get far away, to disappear before he could track her down. She reached for the handle, fingers trembling, and then she felt it. A presence behind her. Her breath caught. A strong, warm hand wrapped around her wrist before she could touch the door. She gasped, spinning around, her heart lurching into her throat. Lucian. He stood there, dark and unmoving, his grip firm yet careful, his eyes locked onto hers with something unreadable, something terrifyingly calm. Scarlet's stomach twisted. Let me go. Lucian didn't move, didn't speak. Scarlet yanked her wrist, but his hold didn't budge. Lucian, let go of me. Finally, he spoke. Low, controlled, lethal. You really thought you could leave me? Scarlet's throat tightened. Lucian's fingers curled slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to make her feel the unspoken warning. I have to go, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Lucian exhaled, slow and measured, but his eyes, those dark, consuming eyes, were anything but calm. No, you don't. Scarlet's stomach clenched. Lucian, he cut her off. You're carrying my children, he murmured. You think I'd let you disappear? Scarlet swallowed hard, hating the way his words sent a shiver down her spine. I need to do this. Lucian's jaw ticked. For who? For me, she whispered. Lucian was silent for a moment. Then, before she could react, he reached down, grabbing the bag from her shoulder. Scarlet gasped. Lucian, he tossed it aside like it was nothing. Her pulse roared. Lucian stepped closer, his presence pressing into her, his body towering over hers. You won't leave, Scarlet. Scarlet clenched her fists. You can't keep me here. Lucian's smirk was slow, dangerous. Can't I? Scarlet's breathing turned shallow. This isn't fair. Lucian's fingers traced along her jaw, tilting her chin up, forcing her to look at him. No, Scarlet, he murmured. What's not fair is you trying to take my children away from me. Scarlet's heart slammed against her ribs. Lucian's hand drifted lower, resting against her stomach. Her breath hitched. A slow exhale left his lips. Something shifted in his expression. Not just dominance, not just control. Something deeper, something raw. Scarlet froze. Lucian's voice dropped to something almost dangerous in its quiet intensity. They're mine, he whispered, just like you are. Scarlet's eyes burned, her chest tightening. Lucian, please. Lucian's grip on her waist tightened, his forehead brushing against hers. I won't lose you, he murmured. Scarlet squeezed her eyes shut. She was trapped, not because Lucian had cornered her, but because a part of her wanted to stay, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. Scarlet turned her face away, trying to steady her breathing, but Lucian didn't move, his fingers curled against her waist, his body tense, his control barely there. I won't let you disappear, he said, voice quieter now. Scarlet's chest ached. You don't own me. Lucian's lips brushed against her temple, a soft exhale ghosting over her skin. You say that, he murmured. But you still haven't told me to let go. Scarlet stilled. Lucian pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, waiting, daring her. Scarlet's fingers trembled as she pushed against his chest, her breath shaky. Lucian, let me go. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he released her. Scarlet stumbled back, sucking in air like she had been drowning. Lucian's gaze remained locked onto hers, but something had shifted, something she couldn't name. You're not leaving, he said simply. Scarlet forced herself to breathe. You don't control me. Lucian's smirk was dark, unreadable. Well, see. Scarlet took another step back, heart thundering. Lucian didn't stop her this time. But as she fled to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her, she heard his voice. Soft, dangerous, a promise that sent chills down her spine. Run if you want, Scarlet, but we both know how this ends. Chapter 11. Scarlet spent the entire night curled up in her bed, her mind racing with everything that had just happened. Lucian knew, and now she was trapped. No, she corrected herself. Not trapped. She could still leave. She could still find a way out of this. But as she lay there, listening to the faint sounds of movement in her apartment, she knew one thing for certain. Lucian wasn't leaving. She should have expected it. He was possessive, controlling, and now that he knew she was carrying his children, he wasn't going to simply let her walk away. Scarlet swallowed hard, placing a hand over her stomach. Triplets. She still couldn't wrap her mind around it. It had been terrifying enough when she thought she was carrying one child. But 3? It wasn't just about her anymore, and that made everything so much worse. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her bedroom door opening. Scarlet sat up immediately, her heart pounding as Lucian stepped inside. He was still here, still watching her. He had loosened his tie, undone the first few buttons of his shirt, but his expression was unreadable, dark, controlled, but simmering with something she couldn't quite name. Scarlet pulled the blanket up around her. You're still here. Lucian leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Of course. Scarlet's stomach clenched. You can't just stay here. Lucian's lips curled slightly. I can do whatever I want. Scarlet clenched her fists. You can't just decide. I can. Lucian cut in smoothly, stepping closer. Because you're carrying my children. That changes everything. Scarlet's breath hitched. Lucian reached the edge of the bed, his gaze never leaving hers. I need you to understand something, Scarlet. Scarlet swallowed hard, her fingers tightening in the sheets. What? Lucian exhaled slowly, his voice low, lethal. You will not leave. Scarlet's pulse roared in her ears. Lucian tilted his head, his fingers brushing along the bedpost as he watched her. You thought you could run, didn't you? Scarlet forced herself to stay still, to hold his gaze. I still can. Lucian smirked. Try. Scarlet froze. The challenge in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't just warning her. He was daring her. Scarlet inhaled sharply, pushing back the fear that clawed at her chest. You can't just keep me here, Lucian. Lucian's eyes darkened. I don't think you understand. He moved, closing the last of the distance between them, leaning down until his face was just inches from hers. I don't lose, Scarlet. His voice was barely above a whisper. And I don't share. Scarlet's stomach twisted. Lucian's fingers brushed along her jaw, slow, deliberate. You belong to me now. You always have. Scarlet swallowed, hating the way her body reacted to his touch. Lucian smirked. I can feel it, you know. Scarlet hated him, hated that even now, with fear twisting inside her, her pulse still raced at his closeness. I don't belong to you, she whispered. Lucian hummed, his fingers trailing lower, pressing just over her stomach. No? Scarlet shuddered. His voice turned softer, almost dangerous in its quiet intensity. Then why are you still here? Scarlet clenched her jaw, shoving his hand away. I don't want this. Lucian exhaled sharply, tilting his head slightly. You think you have a choice? Scarlet's chest tightened. Lucian's fingers curled under her chin, forcing her to look at him. Let me make something very clear. Scarlet glared at him, refusing to back down. Go ahead. Lucian's lips barely twitched. Then he leaned in, his breath hot against her skin, his voice like a lethal promise. You will never leave me, Scarlet. Not now. Not ever. Scarlet's pulse slammed against her ribs. Lucian meant it, and that scared her more than anything else. Chapter 12. Lucian. Lucian had always been a man of control. Everything in his life operated on precision. His company, his wealth, his power. Nothing slipped through his fingers. Nothing. Yet here he was, sitting in Scarlett's apartment, watching her try to figure out a way to escape him. She thought he didn't notice the way her fingers trembled slightly when she picked up her phone. How she kept glancing toward the door as if calculating her chances of making it out before he stopped her. She wouldn't. Lucian leaned back against the couch, watching her with an unreadable expression. He had given her space, time to process everything, but his patience was wearing thin. Scarlett was pregnant with his children. His. And she was still thinking about leaving. Lucian exhaled slowly, keeping his voice calm. "You haven't said a word in the last hour." Scarlett, who was sitting on the opposite end of the couch, arms wrapped around her legs, didn't look at him. "What is there to say?" Lucian's gaze flickered to the soft curve of her stomach, barely visible beneath her sweater. His children were in there. His legacy. And yet, she still acted as if she had a choice in this. Lucian's fingers curled against his thigh. "You're still thinking about running." Scarlett finally met his gaze, something unreadable in her eyes. "You act like I belong to you," Lucian smirked. "Don't you?" Her jaw tightened. "You don't own me, Lucian." Lucian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes locking onto hers. "Scarlett, I need you to understand something." Scarlett crossed her arms. "I don't need to understand anything." Lucian exhaled sharply. "You think this is just about you? About your freedom?" His voice darkened. "You are carrying my children. That changes everything." Scarlett stiffened but didn't look away. "You act like I'm some possession you can lock away." Lucian tilted his head slightly. "If it keeps you safe, I will." Scarlett sucked in a breath, but before she could argue, Lucian stood. He needed air, space, because the truth was she was his, and it was driving him insane that she hadn't accepted it yet. He walked toward the window, staring out over the city. It had never looked small to him before. But now, all he could think about was how many places Scarlett could hide if she got away from him. She wouldn't. Lucian turned back to face her. "You don't trust me." Scarlett let out a sharp breath. "You think?" Lucian's lips twitched slightly. "I'm not asking for your trust." He took a slow step toward her. "I'm telling you that no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try to run, I will always find you." Scarlett swallowed hard, but he saw the way her body reacted to his words, the way her pulse raced just beneath the delicate skin of her throat. Lucian sat on the edge of the couch, his fingers reaching out to trace lightly over her wrist. She shuddered, but didn't pull away. "Progress." "I won't hurt you," he murmured. Scarlett scoffed. "You already are." Lucian exhaled, his fingers tightening around her wrist. "I don't know how to be gentle, Scarlett." His voice dropped lower. "But I will protect what's mine. You and the babies." Scarlett closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "You can't keep me here forever," Lucian smirked. "Want to bet?" Scarlett let out a frustrated breath and shoved his hand away. "I hate you," Lucian chuckled darkly. "No, you don't." Scarlett turned away, her body tense, her mind working through scenarios. He knew she was still planning something, but what she didn't realize was that he would always be one step ahead. Lucian leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Go ahead, Scarlett. Run if you want. Try to escape me." His voice dropped to a whisper. "It will only make it more fun when I bring you back." Scarlett's breath hitched. Lucian smiled, because no matter how much she fought him, she was already his. Chapter 13. Scarlett sat in the passenger seat of Lucian's sleek black car, staring out at the blurred city lights as they passed. She still couldn't believe this was happening. Lucian had given her no choice. One moment, she was trapped in her apartment, still searching for a way to escape. The next, he had told her she was coming with him, had packed her things himself, and now, here they were, driving toward his home. Her new prison. Lucian hadn't spoken much during the drive. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough, radiating power, control, the same control he had now exerted over her entire life. Scarlett exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her stomach. The babies. Everything was happening so fast. She had barely processed the fact that she was pregnant with 3 children, and now Lucian was making all the decisions for her. She turned to face him, her voice cold. "You think dragging me to your house is going to change anything?" Lucian didn't glance at her. He kept his eyes on the road, his fingers gripping the steering wheel with effortless confidence. "I'm not dragging you anywhere," he said smoothly. "I'm taking care of what's mine." Scarlett's stomach twisted. "I am not yours." Lucian's lips twitched, but he said nothing. Scarlet clenched her fists. You can't just decide where I live, Lucian. Lucian finally turned his head slightly, his dark gaze pinning her in place. I can, and I have. Scarlet gritted her teeth. You don't own me. Lucian's smirk was slow, dangerous. Then why are you in my car, driving to my home? Scarlet sucked in a sharp breath, frustration burning through her veins. She wanted to fight him, to scream, to make him understand that she wasn't some possession to be controlled. But deep down, she knew. Lucian Blackwood didn't lose battles. And this? This wasn't even a battle to him. It was a victory. The car pulled through the massive iron gates of his estate, winding down a long driveway until they reached the entrance of an impossibly large mansion. Scarlet stared up at it, her breath catching. It was breathtaking. Dark stone, high windows, towering columns. The kind of place that felt untouchable, like a kingdom belonging to a man who ruled over everything he saw. Lucian parked the car and stepped out, coming around to her side. He opened the door, but Scarlet didn't move. Lucian arched a brow. Get out. Scarlet crossed her arms. No. Lucian let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Scarlet, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Scarlet narrowed her eyes. Go to hell, Lucian smirked. Already there, sweetheart, and you're coming with me. Before she could react, Lucian reached inside, unbuckled her seatbelt, and lifted her effortlessly into his arms. Scarlet gasped, struggling against him. Scarlet's pulse skipped, and she hated the way her body reacted. Lucian's hand trailed to her stomach, his palm resting there with silent possession. And so are they. Scarlet shoved his hand away. You're insane, Lucian exhaled slowly, amusement flickering in his gaze. And yet you still haven't tried to run. Scarlet's fists clenched. Because I know you'll catch me. Lucian smiled, slow, dark, satisfied. Exactly. Scarlet turned away, needing space, needing air. But just as she stepped forward, a voice cut through the tension. Well, a woman's voice drawled from the grand staircase. Lucian Blackwood finally brings a woman home. I never thought I'd see the day. Scarlet froze. Lucian's body stiffened beside her. Scarlet turned toward the voice, her breath catching, as she saw a woman standing at the top of the stairs, draped in an elegant silk dress, her dark hair cascading in loose waves. She was stunning, effortlessly poised, and clearly comfortable in Lucian's house. Scarlet's stomach twisted. The woman smiled, but there was something cold beneath it. I suppose introductions are in order, she said smoothly. I'm Celeste, Lucian's ex-fiancée. Scarlet felt the floor shift beneath her. Ex-fiancée? She turned to Lucian, her heart pounding. You were engaged? Lucian's jaw ticked, his gaze unreadable. It was a long time ago. Scarlet crossed her arms. Funny how you failed to mention that. Celeste let out a quiet laugh. Oh, darling, there's a lot Lucian fails to mention. Her eyes flickered to Scarlet's stomach, her red lips curling. But I suppose that doesn't matter now, does it? Scarlet's stomach clenched. She hated the way Celeste looked at her, like she was something temporary, like she was just another woman in Lucian's life. Lucian's voice was cold. Too cold. What are you doing here, Celeste? Celeste smiled, stepping down the stairs with graceful ease. I came to talk, of course. You never did like to leave things unresolved. Scarlet could feel the tension in Lucian's body, the way his fingers twitched slightly, as if resisting the urge to do something dangerous. Scarlet swallowed hard, hating the surge of jealousy in her chest. Lucian had a past, a life before her. But what if Celeste wasn't just the past? What if she was a threat? And for the first time, Scarlet realized Lucian wasn't just her problem anymore. Now, she had 3 children to protect, and she had no idea just how far Celeste would go to come between them. Chapter 14. Scarlet stood frozen, her hands instinctively resting over her stomach. Celeste's presence felt like a storm cloud settling over the mansion, beautiful, elegant, and dangerously unpredictable. Lucian's ex-fiancée. Scarlet hadn't thought much about Lucian's past before, but now, standing in his home, pregnant with his children, it felt personal. Celeste took another slow step forward, her eyes never leaving Scarlet. You look so young. Her red lips curved into something between amusement and pity. Tell me, darling, how did you manage to do what no other woman could? Scarlet's jaw clenched. Excuse me? Celeste's gaze flickered downward, landing on Scarlet's stomach. Get Lucian to finally settle down. Scarlet's stomach twisted. She didn't know what Celeste was getting at, but she didn't like the way she said it, like it was a game Scarlet had won by accident. Lucian's voice was sharp. Celeste, enough. Celeste barely glanced at him. What? I'm just making conversation. She tilted her head slightly. I mean, surely she knows you don't do relationships, Lucian. Or have you changed? Scarlett hated the way doubt crept into her mind. Lucian hadn't exactly been open about his past, about why things ended with Celeste, or what she meant to him before now. Scarlett turned to him, her voice quiet but firm. Did you love her? Lucian's eyes snapped to hers, his entire body tensing. Scarlett? Scarlett lifted her chin. Answer me. Celeste let out a soft chuckle. Oh, darling, you don't have to ask. I already know the answer. Scarlett's chest tightened. Lucian exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. Celeste, leave. Celeste smirked. So, you're still avoiding hard questions, I see. Lucian stepped forward, his presence imposing, his control barely contained. Now, for the first time, Celeste hesitated. Scarlett noticed it immediately. Lucian was no longer the man Celeste had known. He was darker now, more dangerous, more possessive, and Celeste could see it. Celeste let out a soft sigh, rolling her shoulders back. Fine, she murmured. But well, talk soon, Lucian. You can't ignore the past forever. With that, she turned on her heel and walked toward the door, her confidence unwavering. Scarlett didn't move until she heard the click of the front door closing. Only then did she exhale, her fingers trembling. Lucian turned to her immediately, his expression unreadable. Scarlett. Scarlett stepped back, Lucian's jaw clenched. Don't do that. Scarlett swallowed hard. Don't do what? Lucian took another step forward, his voice dangerously soft. Distance yourself from me. Scarlett let out a sharp breath. What did she mean, Lucian? Why did she act like she knew something I don't? Lucian's gaze darkened. Because she wanted to get in your head. Scarlett's stomach twisted. And is she right? Did you ever love her? Lucian exhaled, his fingers running through his hair. It wasn't love, Scarlett. It was necessary. Scarlett frowned. Necessary? Lucian hesitated. Then, finally, he spoke. My father arranged our engagement, he said slowly. It was about business, not love. I ended it when I took control of my company. His voice dropped lower. She didn't take it well. Scarlett blinked, trying to process his words. Celeste wasn't just an ex-fiancée. She was someone Lucian had been forced to be with. Lucian took another slow step toward her. I never belonged to her. I never Lucian took another slow step toward her. I never belonged to her. I never wanted to. Scarlett looked away. And yet, she's still here, still in your life. Lucian tilted her chin back up, forcing her to meet his gaze. No, Scarlett, you are my life now. Scarlett hated how easily his words unraveled her defenses. But before she could say anything, Lucian's grip tightened slightly, his voice dropping. You don't have to question me, Scarlett. You are carrying my children. You are mine. Scarlett swallowed, her body betraying her as warmth spread through her chest. Lucian's dominance, his possessive protectiveness, had always terrified her, but now it made her feel safe. Scarlett inhaled slowly, her lips parting. Lucian, A loud crash echoed through the house. Scarlett jumped, her heartbeat skyrocketing. Lucian immediately shifted, stepping in front of her, his entire body tense. Scarlett's voice wavered. What was that? Lucian's expression darkened. Stay here. Scarlett's pulse pounded as she grabbed his arm. Lucian, wait. But he was already moving, his presence deadly, controlled as he strode toward the source of the noise. Scarlett's breath came fast. Something was wrong, and for the first time she realized Celeste wasn't just trying to come between them, she was dangerous. Chapter 15. Scarlett's breath came in short, shallow bursts as she watched Lucian disappear down the hallway, his movements controlled yet filled with purposeful danger. Something was wrong. The sound of the crash still echoed in her ears, a sharp reminder that Celeste wasn't finished with them. Scarlett wanted to follow him, needed to follow him, but Lucian had told her to stay put. Scarlett's fingers instinctively curled over her stomach. The babies. She wasn't just protecting herself anymore. Still, she couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Ignoring every rational thought, she stepped forward, following the path Lucian had taken. She kept close to the wall, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. As she reached the entrance to the grand hallway, she saw Lucian standing near the doorway, his back straight, his presence imposing. But what made Scarlett's stomach drop was Celeste. She was standing there, her silk dress slightly wrinkled, a broken vase at her feet, and in her hand, a gun. Scarlett's breath hitched. Lucian remained completely still, his gaze locked onto Celeste with a terrifying calm. Put it down, he said, his voice low, lethal. Celeste let out a soft laugh. Why? Because you said so? Her grip on the gun tightened. That's always been the problem, Lucian. You think you can control everything. Scarlet froze. Lucian was blocking her view, shielding her from Celeste's line of sight. Scarlet knew what he was doing. Protecting her. Protecting their children. Celeste's gaze flickered toward Scarlet. A cruel smile spread across her lips. Oh, look, your new little toy didn't listen to you. She came running after you like a lost puppy. Lucian didn't move, but his voice dropped into something deadly. Scarlet, he murmured, not looking at her. Go back to the bedroom. Scarlet's throat tightened. Lucian, Now. Scarlet hesitated. Celeste's eyes glimmered with amusement. Ah, poor Scarlet, stuck with a man who doesn't even let her make decisions for herself. Lucian's fists curled at his sides. Celeste, he warned. Celeste's smile disappeared. Do you have any idea what it's been like? Her voice trembled slightly, raw with anger. You left me, you humiliated me, and now you think you get to have a happy ending? Lucian took a slow step forward. You were never mine, Celeste. His tone was cold, like steel. And you never will be. Celeste's fingers twitched around the gun. No, she whispered. But if I can't have you, she sure as hell won't either. Scarlet's body went cold. Before she could react, Celeste lifted the gun. A sharp crack rang through the air. Scarlet screamed. Lucian moved fast, too fast. He shoved Scarlet out of the way, his body twisting just as the gun went off. Scarlet hit the floor, her heart hammering. Lucian. The bullet missed, embedding itself in the wall. Lucian was on Celeste before she could fire again. He twisted the gun from her grip in one fluid motion, yanking her arms behind her back with terrifying ease. Celeste let out a sharp cry, struggling against him. You don't get to do this to me, she shrieked. You don't get to ruin my life and walk away. Lucian didn't speak. He turned her toward the security team that had just rushed inside. His voice was pure command. Take her away. Celeste thrashed as two guards restrained her, dragging her toward the door. Her eyes burned into Scarlet, filled with hatred. This isn't over, she spat. Lucian stepped in front of Scarlet, blocking Celeste's view. Yes, it is, he said coldly. Celeste let out a final frustrated scream as the guards pulled her out of the house. And then just like that, she was gone. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Scarlet couldn't move. Her entire body shook. Lucian turned, his eyes immediately landing on her, checking her. He crouched down, his hands firm but gentle as he ran them over her arms. Are you hurt? Scarlet swallowed hard. No, but you pushed me. Are you... Lucian cupped her face, his grip firm, desperate. You could have been killed. Scarlet exhaled shakily, placing her hands over his. But I wasn't. Lucian's jaw tightened, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, something raw. For the first time, Scarlet saw it. Real fear. Not control, not dominance. Fear of losing her. Scarlet's chest ached. Lucian Blackwood was an overbearing, possessive, ruthless man. Chapter 16. Scarlet sat on the edge of the massive bed in Lucian's estate, her fingers grazing over the soft fabric of her nightgown. The past few hours had been a whirlwind. Celeste was gone. Lucian had protected her, had shielded her without hesitation, proving once again that there was nothing he wouldn't do for her. And now, she was here, with him, safe. Scarlet exhaled slowly, staring down at her stomach. Their children. Lucian had made it clear she wasn't going anywhere. And maybe, just maybe, she had stopped wanting to. The sound of the door opening pulled her from her thoughts. Lucian entered the room, his presence immediately filling the space. His tie was undone, the first few buttons of his shirt loosened, as if even his control had its limits tonight. His dark eyes locked onto hers. You should be sleeping. Scarlet held his gaze. So should you. Lucian smirked, but said nothing. Instead, he strode toward her, his movements slow, calculated, like a predator making sure his prey wasn't planning to run. Scarlet's heart pounded, but this time it wasn't from fear. Lucian crouched in front of her, his hands resting on either side of her thighs. You're thinking too much. Scarlet swallowed. I have a lot to think about. Lucian's fingers traced over her knee, feather-light. Then let me make it simple for you. Scarlet exhaled shakily. Lucian, I love you. Scarlet's breath caught. Lucian never hesitated, never wavered. His voice was steady, absolute. Scarlet searched his face, her chest tightening. You? You do? Lucian smirked. That surprises you? Scarlet let out a weak laugh. A little. Lucian's gaze softened, but his hands tightened their grip on her thighs. You drive me insane, he murmured. You fight me at every turn. You challenge me in ways no one ever has. Scarlett's pulse raced. Lucian's thumb brushed over her skin, slow, deliberate. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Scarlett's eyes burned. Lucian. He leaned in, his lips ghosting over hers. Tell me you love me too. Scarlett's chest ached, because she did. She had fought it. Had tried to convince herself that what she felt for Lucian was just obsession, just chemistry, just circumstance. But it wasn't. It was so much more. Scarlett cupped his face, her fingers tracing the sharp lines of his jaw. I love you, Lucian. Lucian's breath hitched, his grip on her tightening. Scarlett smiled softly, brushing her lips against his. And I love the way you love me. Lucian's smirk was slow, possessive. Then let me show you just how much. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to the center of the bed. Scarlett didn't resist, because she didn't want to fight him anymore. She just wanted him. Chapter 17. Scarlett woke to the feeling of warmth surrounding her, Lucian's arm draped protectively over her waist. His steady breathing fanned against her neck, his presence undeniable even in sleep. She had never felt safer. She turned slowly, careful not to wake him, but the moment she moved, Lucian's grip tightened. You're not leaving this bed, he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. Scarlett smiled. I wasn't planning to. Lucian's eyes cracked open, dark and heavy with something raw, possessive. Good. Scarlett reached up, brushing her fingers through his tousled hair. You never stop, do you? Lucian smirked lazily, pulling her closer. Not when it comes to you. Scarlett let out a breathless laugh, her heart so full it almost hurt. She had spent so much time resisting him, fighting against the inevitability of this. But now she didn't want to fight anymore. Lucian cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her bottom lip. I meant what I said last night. Scarlett swallowed. I know. Lucian's gaze hardened. Then I need you to know something else. Scarlett's stomach fluttered. What? Lucian exhaled slowly, his grip firm, unyielding. I want to marry you. Scarlett's heart stopped. She stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. Lucian, I don't want to wait, he interrupted, his voice low, certain, undeniable. Scarlett's breath hitched. Lucian had never been a man who hesitated. Never. And now? He was looking at her like she was his entire world. Scarlett's throat tightened. You're serious? Lucian's lips curled. I don't joke about the things I own, Scarlett. Scarlett shoved his chest. You do not own me. Lucian chuckled, catching her hand before she could pull away. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his voice dropping to a whisper. Then say no. Scarlett's pulse raced. She couldn't, because she didn't want to. Lucian's smirk deepened. That's what I thought. Scarlett exhaled, her chest aching with something terrifyingly wonderful. I hate you. Lucian grinned. Say yes. Scarlett shook her head, but a smile tugged at her lips. Lucian tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. Say it, Scarlett. Scarlett inhaled sharply. She had never imagined herself getting married. Not like this. Not to a man like Lucian Blackwood. But God, she wanted to. She wanted him. Scarlett licked her lips, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, Lucian stilled. Then, before she could process it, he crushed his lips against hers, kissing her with a hunger that stole the air from her lungs. Scarlett clung to him, letting herself fall completely. She was his, and now she always would be. Chapter 18. Scarlett stood in front of the floor-length mirror, her hands smoothing over the fabric of her wedding dress. It had all happened so fast. Lucian didn't believe in waiting. The moment she had said yes, he had set everything into motion. In just a few days, he had arranged an intimate yet extravagant ceremony at his estate, ensuring that nothing stood in their way. Scarlett had barely had time to process it. Now she was just minutes away from becoming Scarlett Blackwood. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned, expecting a member of the staff, but instead she found Lucian. Her breath caught. You're not supposed to see me before the ceremony, she murmured. Lucian smirked, stepping inside anyway. Rules don't apply to me. Scarlett rolled her eyes, but warmth spread through her chest as he closed the distance between them. Lucian looked at her like he was devouring her. His fingers traced along the lace of her dress, his touch burning through the fabric. You look breathtaking. Scarlett's pulse skipped. Lucian's gaze darkened. Say it. Scarlett swallowed. Say what? Lucian's grip tightened slightly at her waist. That you're mine. Scarlett exhaled shakily. You already know I am. Lucian's smirk deepened. Then marry me before I lose my patience and take you now. Scarlet flushed, her stomach twisting in anticipation. Lucian leaned in, brushing his lips against hers. "Are you ready?" Scarlet met his gaze, feeling everything click into place. She had spent so long running, so long fighting him, but not anymore. She wanted this. She wanted him. Scarlet smiled softly. "Let's get married." Lucian's expression softened for just a moment, before possessiveness took over once again. "You'll never regret this, Scarlet," he murmured. Scarlet wasn't so sure about that. But as he kissed her one last time before the ceremony, she knew one thing for certain. Lucian Blackwood wasn't just her husband, he was her forever. Chapter 19, the final chapter. Scarlet stood on the balcony of the Blackwood estate, the cool evening breeze brushing against her skin. The city lights flickered in the distance, but all she could focus on was the warmth surrounding her, Lucian. His arms wrapped around her from behind, his palm resting protectively over her swollen belly. She sighed, melting into him. So much had changed. She had once feared him, fought against the control he exerted over her life. Now, she understood it. Lucian didn't just control. He protected, he claimed. He loved with a fierceness that terrified and consumed her. And she loved it, loved him. "Penny for your thoughts," Lucian murmured against her ear, his voice thick with possession. Scarlet exhaled softly, placing her hand over his. "Just thinking about how much you've ruined my life." Lucian smirked, his lips brushing along the curve of her neck. "Ruined it or made it mine?" Scarlet turned in his arms, her heart swelling as she looked up at her husband, the ruthless, dominant man who had changed her life forever. She smirked. "Both." Lucian chuckled, but his gaze softened, his hand caressing the side of her face. "Do you regret it?" Scarlet's breath caught. She placed her hands over his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her fingertips. "No," she whispered. "I don't." Lucian's grip tightened, his eyes flashing with something dark, something undeniably his. "Good," he murmured, "because I would have never let you leave anyway." Scarlet laughed, shaking her head. "I know." Lucian smirked, brushing his lips over hers. "Say it again," Scarlet exhaled against him. "I love you." Lucian devoured her in that moment, his kiss slow, deep, and undeniably his. As the wind howled around them, as their world settled into the only thing that had ever been inevitable, Scarlet knew one thing for certain. She had never belonged to herself. She had always been his, and she wouldn't have it any other way. Epilogue, 1 year later. Scarlet sat in the nursery, gently rocking one of the babies in her arms. The other two were asleep in their cribs, their soft breaths filling the dimly lit room. Lucian stood in the doorway, watching her. She looked up, smiling softly. "They're finally asleep." Lucian stepped forward, his fingers tracing along her jaw before tilting her face up to his. "And what about you, Mrs. Blackwood?" Scarlet smirked, exhaustion laced with amusement. "Completely at your mercy, Mr. Blackwood." Lucian's eyes darkened with satisfaction. "Good." Scarlet rolled her eyes, but let him pull her into his arms. She had fought him, she had run from him. But in the end, Lucian Blackwood had won, and she had never wanted to lose so badly. The end. Epilogue, 1 year later. Scarlet sat in the grand living room of the Blackwood estate, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, casting a golden glow over everything. The soft cooing of her babies filled the space, a sound that had become the melody of her life. She still couldn't believe it sometimes. She was Scarlet Blackwood, wife to Lucian Blackwood, mother to their 3 beautiful children. A year ago, she had been fighting for her freedom, convinced that Lucian's control over her was something to fear. Now, she knew better. Lucian had never trapped her, he had claimed her, and she had let him. Scarlet smiled, shifting one of the babies in her arms while the other 2 slept peacefully in the crib beside her. She gently kissed her son's forehead, inhaling the soft, familiar scent of baby powder and warmth. A presence loomed behind her before she even turned. She felt him. Always. Lucian. His large hands rested on her shoulders, his warmth enveloping her from behind. He leaned down, his lips grazing the side of her neck. Scarlet shivered, leaning into him. "You're back early." Lucian hummed against her skin. "I couldn't stay away." Scarlet smiled, tilting her head back to look at him. "Business didn't keep you occupied?" Lucian's dark gaze flickered to the babies. Their children. The only thing in the world that could make the ruthless, dominant man soften. "No," he murmured. "You're far more important." Scarlet's heart swelled. Lucian reached down, carefully lifting their daughter from the crib. The sight of him, a powerful, dangerous man cradling something so small, so innocent, made Scarlet's throat tighten. "You act like you don't already own the world," she teased. Lucian's smirk was slow, dangerous. "I do." Written by Maria. Thank you all for taking the time to dive into this story with me. I truly appreciate your support and love hearing your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey filled with passion, drama, and unexpected twists, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. There's so much more to come, and I can't wait to share it all with you. Stay tuned for more incredible stories, and as always, thank you for being part of this amazing journey. See you in the next one.